That's your book there, right, Mark?
It's my pleasure to introduce Tony Starr, who is an independent researcher from St. Louis. Tony is also a member of the Historical Society of Madison County here in Missouri. And he really developed his interest in mine La Motte when he authored a story on the history of the S-Bar F Scout Ranch, a Boy Scout camp, that covers 1/5 of the whole old mine La Motte. So please welcome Tony Starr as he talks to us.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, how's the sound level? I'm supposed to yell. Is that working out?
Raise your mic. Raise your mic.
Okay. You don't want me to yell? You want me to do this instead? Okay. Well, I won't yell. I'll do this instead. How's the sound level? Okay, good. Thank you, June and Bob, and to the Foundation for the Restoration for inviting me here to talk to you today. The Mine La Motte domain is 24,010 acres, straddling the Madison and St. Francis County lines in southeast Missouri. I will refer to it as the domain throughout. It's part of the southeast Missouri lead belt, the richest concentration of lead resources in North America. Historian and historic geographer Walter Schrader has called the Mine La Motte domain the oldest continually European titled land in what is now the state of Missouri. Lead was extracted from the domain for 243 years, and it remained a unified parcel for 206 of those years. So my objective today is to review the history of the domain, discuss elements that both isolated and preserved the integrity of the domain, such as its remoteness, scarcity of capital, insecurity of title, and conflicting claims and dilettante ownership. To discuss the links between the domain and the French Creole corridor, and I have to start with a warning that it will be necessary for me to pronounce French. This will be painful for all of us, but it cannot be avoided. Pointed it the wrong way. Okay. As June said, my interest derives from my experience as a Boy Scout and then in high school and college as a camp staff member of the S-Bar F Scout Ranch, which takes up 5,200 acres. And on my off time, I would hike around the backcountry of the ranch, and I would come across ruins that showed that there were people there before there were Boy Scouts. And I followed that up and met some descendants of those family members, such as Darrell Miller, standing here in the 15 by 15 horizontal log cabin that his father lived in. Grew up with his 10 brothers and sisters in that small thing, cutting wood out in the middle of nowhere. Hiking around the ranch, I would hike upon roads that were old in 1871 when this drawing was made, and walking by Castle Rock, which is our great geologic wonder on the S-Bar F Scout Ranch, you find names that are ancient in the Illinois country, such as that Lachante's name. And I would later talk to descendants and discover that Lachantes lived in at least 3 places on the S-Bar F Scout Ranch. The S-Bar F Scout Ranch superimposed on a USGS map, and then like other land grants, the outline of the domain can still be seen. And it's this really weird double diamond shape, which is odd, and there are good reasons for why it is odd. But the domain persists today. I don't know. Okay, geology makes topography and history. French colonials explored the highlands west of the river for minerals. We're looking at part of a geologic map, and we are right now in this nice, sitting on this nice blue bit here on 325 million year old St. Genevieve Formation. The old town and the Grand Champ would have been on that nice yellow, meaning the youngest formation, Mississippi alluvial soil, much less than 100,000 years old. But our lead story starts to the west in this attractive purple, which is the oldest rock, and we're talking 1.5 to 1.3 billion years ago. Our story begins with igneous rock eruptions and intrusions. 500 million years ago, the lead-bearing sedimentary rocks form as the seas wash in and wash out. They deposit the La Motte sandstone and the Bonne Terre dolomite, which become the host rocks for lead, the reason for our story. And then 300 million years ago is the last of several, but the biggest, Ozark uplift, where this igneous rock area here is pushed upward, raising it up, forming the St. Francis Mountains in the center of the Ozark Dome, which is the defining element of the Ozark area. Erosion has been happening ever since then, and the igneous rocks are exposed in some areas, like Tomsock Mountain and other areas where there's granite and rhyolite knobs. As the lead-bearing formations erode away, but they don't completely erode away. They're still there around those knobs. And as they erode away from the knobs, lead ore is left behind. And it's that lead ore in what geologists call pinch-outs or sills, meaning little areas, let's say, next to that igneous core that hasn't eroded, and low areas nearby, where over millions of years this lead accumulates as what miners would call a surface deposit, meaning this is lead in the clay as opposed to the lead beneath it still in those lead-bearing rocks. It's the lead in that clay, those surface deposits, that our colonial ancestors are working. The first report we get, as I think Will Thompson handled this very nicely, is from Father Gravier in 1700. Whether he visited the area himself or not is unknown, but 1700 for the Merrimack mines. And the Merrimack mines are, it's hard for me to see, are up here. Then in the next historical encounter is 1715, when Governor of Louisiana Antoine Lomé de La Motte Cadillac, a great character himself, worthy of a discussion, travels up from Mobile under a victim of fraud to check out the rich silver mines that have been located west of Kaskaskia. And he goes there and in 1715 to take his samples, and ever after that, the diggings, which are here. This is the lead-bearing area of the Mine-La-Motte domain, that tiny little one compared to those great big ones, which would forever bear his name. And I want to point something out about the small size of that area for Mine-La-Motte. You think, well, gee, there's a lot more lead in other places, but it doesn't really work that way. The depth of these deposits at Mine-La-Motte are among the richest in the whole area. So even though it's a small little area like that, there are many, 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 many hundreds of times more lead in the Mine-La-Motte than there were in this huge area up at the Merrimack mine. So size doesn't always matter. 1719, or maybe the year, Philippe Francois Reynaud checks out the Mina Reynaud in that area. 1763, a little bit down and to the right, you get the Mina Breton discovery, which starts the Potosi subdistrict. And then there are later formations that don't fit into our story at all, but the incredibly rich Bonne Terre formation of Flat River and all that, and what is being worked today, the viburnum trend. Those don't figure into our discussions because that's all hard rock mining and not available to our earlier miners. There's another thing we need to know about this map. Again, it's a geologic map, not a topographic map, but there's a correlation. So we have this purple. That whole area is going to be higher and rougher than these other nice soothing colors around it. So not only is the domain, the lead deposit of the domain, compact and in a small area, but it's also separated physically in a profound way, more than you might think. You have to remember, we're talking about rough terrain here, from the rest of the lead deposits. It also has a relatively rougher route to the river than the old mines area and other areas had, and that will play into our story. 1715, Tamaroa Indians guide Lamont Cadillac from, well, he would have started in Kaskaskia, which would be under the river after the 1881 jump, but they would have gone down the Kaskaskia River, crossed the Mississippi at La Saline, which I've indicated with that lovely star there, and headed into the mining country. In 1719, that same route by those same Indian guides was taken by Marc-Antoine de la Loire des Ursins, who was a company of the West official, and he left us a memo with directions. He leaves us bearings and distances in this memo over here. And if we plot that, adjusting for the declination change over the centuries, 1.8 degrees, and accounting for 2.76 miles per league, we get this line which leads very closely to where I want it to end, which is the Castor vein and the Golden vein at Mine Lamont, which have always been considered among the most ancient, and the Castor vein is itself mentioned in old records, which we will see. So the basic route is, this is an old Indian foot or horse path, so you're going up the creek. You're going up Saline Creek, crossing a dividing ridge only once where you have to, then dropping down Rock Creek to the area near the mines. Today, if you're going to drive that, you can't drive it exactly, but kind of, sort of. You could do Highway N to Saline Creek Road to Bidwell Creek, and when you get to Bidwell Creek Road, it has this nice zigzag on it, crossing across the zigzag-shaped top of that ridge line, which drops you then right back down where you need to be to continue on Highway T to Rock Creek Road to 00 to the mines in Fredericktown today. So it's a very nice fit, and it also makes sense to what we would expect. The early miners would have moved that lead over that track on horses. So this drawing over here is as close as I can find. This is actually in Great Britain. They're hauling 120-pound iron bars instead of 80-pound lead, but they're not wearing lead as horse collars around their neck. You can imagine that a system similar to that with 4 or 5 bars would have been used at the time, colonial times. We have records from Antoine Valentin Dumesnil, Val, whatever his name is, Degree. He has a lot of long names because he was an important guy. The longer your name, the more important you were. He leaves us records for 1741 and 1742, which he said were high production years for lead under the Reynaud regime, where in a year they produced 2,300 pigs per year. That works out to about 80 tons. That's about 510 trips for one laden horse. So that's the kind of volume we're talking about. Reynaud gets his grant on the 14th of June, 1723. Can't find the file copy of the original grant. This is an 1805 transcription, which is the oldest thing I can find. But he gets 4 parcels, 2 on the east side of the river, 1 way up by Lake Peoria, which doesn't matter to any of us, 1 at what is now southern Monroe County, the great agricultural fields, and then 2 in Missouri, 1 the old mines that Dr. Thompson was talking about, and then the other, of course, Mine Lamont, which is our favorite lead mine. So that document creates the Mine Lamont domain, but it was never surveyed in colonial times, so I don't have a cool picture for you of what it looked like. But it's clear that Reynaud intended to, and largely succeeded in running what today we would think of as a vertically integrated company. On the east side, he had those great fields where he could grow food, both to sustain his operation, but more important, to sell to raise capital. He had tracts of ore fields on the west side of the river, which were large. The Mine-la-Motte domain is 2 leagues square. Well, the mining area is a tiny little part of that, but you need a lot of timber if you're going to do these mines, as we will discuss. So he has both the ore and the timber. And he has slaves to provide cheap labor, which we will discuss more and has been discussed a lot earlier. Again, as was said earlier, they would have mined primarily between the sowing and the harvest. But Reynaud faced problems. He had a good idea, a great plan. He wasn't expecting to find silver. All that silliness had been done with by the time he got there. But the company reneged on their promise to deliver new slaves to him every year, a certain number. I forget what it was. Was it 25 or something? 25. Yeah, something like that. And he never got those. So he never got the huge slave army that might have helped him. And they cut off his credit because, of course, John Law's scheme had collapsed, which would be another great discussion. And so he didn't have any money. In 1731, the company quit the colony entirely and dumped it back onto the crown. Well, the crown didn't have any money to invest in this either. So in 1742, Reynaud abandoned his claims and left the country. Quite simply, with the technology available to him, he needed large amounts of slave labor to make this work and did not have it. And the lack of slaves in the Illinois country was a complaint throughout the whole colonial period, and not just from miners. What happens after Reynaud? Strangely, unlike the rest of his concession, the Mine-la-Motte domain does not revert to the crown. Another concession is never issued from any authority in the colonial period. We don't know why this is. Why is it different than all of his other properties? Unknown, but that's what happens. What does develop is an informal system of ownership that we might call squatters' rights in a way. And we see some indications of that in the old Kaskaskia records. In 1743, we see Jean-Baptiste Manson borrowing money in this case, he bought a horse, a bridle, a saddle, and a hut at Mine-la-Motte. So he's going out there to work. He doesn't have title to it, but he is living there. Later in 1743, we see Jean-Francois Morissette incurring a debt in order to work the mines at Mine-la-Motte. Now his document here clearly says that he lived at Mine-la-Motte, but we might need to say that, well, maybe they meant seasonally. But who knows? Maybe he was a year-round resident at Mine-la-Motte. And then a key foundational document for, well, the future of St. Genevieve and the whole district of the Illinois country is Francois Valley and Joseph Liberville D. Joseph's partnership formed in June of 1744. This would be the beginning of the foundational Valley fortune. This partnership dissolved in a year or two, but this contract clearly says that Valley resided at Mine-la-Motte. Again, was he there all the time, or was he living there part-time? We don't know. Valley had moved to Kaskaskia from Canada in 1739, and in the 40s and the 50s, he mined at Mine-la-Motte to build the fortune that he used very wisely to buy agricultural land across the river in Kaskaskia, parlaying that into what would be the greatest fortune, according to Carl Eckberg, the greatest fortune in the Illinois country at the time of his death. But they were doing this work under the primitive conditions that Dr. Thompson covered with Antoine Valentin degree, making fun of the methods in use and the character of the men doing it. They were primitive operations. They would dig ore. Well, first they would prospect for the ore using an iron rod, pounding it through the ground. Remember, they're not looking for ore in basement rock. They wouldn't be able to deal with it if they could. They're looking for the ore disseminated through this clay laying on top, which could be many feet thick. They're doing this with iron rods, and then they're digging with picks and shovels. And when they find their ore bed that they're going to work, they dig a hole and they pull all of the ore out of it that they can until it either runs out, they hit bedrock, or very often in this area, the thing fills in with water and they don't have pumps, so they just have to go on and dig another hole someplace else. Degree casually dismisses their dedication to work by saying, they only dig enough ore to fund a year's worth of life. But we know that isn't true, definitely not in the case of Francois Valley. He is building his rise to greatness in the future. So they dig this ore, then they essentially build a very large campfire, cut down 2 or 3 trees, cut the logs into 5-foot segments, build a fire lay, dump a couple thousand pounds of ore into the top, which they've washed in a river, and kind of pick the non-galena rocks off the side. And then they dump a couple more trees on top of that. They set it on fire. It takes about 24 hours for this reaction to happen. It's a 2-part deal. First you have to oxidize, and then you use the sulfur coming out of the new metal you put on there to drive the sulfur off. Incredibly hazardous, all this vapor lead moving around. And the lead is dripping out of the bottom of this into a channel that they've dug, and it collects in a pool, and they ladle it out, and they put it in these molds, which were probably cut out of split logs, to make these 60 to 80 pound flat bars that they're going to transport to the river. If you're really good at what you're doing with this system, apparently, and you do it 3 times for each load of ore, they could recover 50% of the ore, the lead available. But as I said earlier, though, that it's more than just they're out there digging ore. They're acquiring some sort of a right to do this informally. And we see with these 2 documents here, both involving negociant, merchant of St. Genevieve, Daniel Blouin, that he bought in 2 years, in 63 and 64, 4 square arpents, and then the next year 6 square arpents from other miners. And there are other names that come out, like we see La Rose and Chatal and Gagnon, names that we know in the Illinois country. But he's not only, he's buying the land, and in the case of this exchange, a newly discovered vein of lead that La Rose had discovered. And this is not a Daguerre La Rose, this is a Noël de La Rose. And a horse, buildings, and tools. So he's buying the whole outfit, he's expanding. The next year, he's buying 6 square arpents, a house. It's called a maison. It's not called a cabane or cabinet. It's called a maison. What does that mean? I don't know. And mineral rights. And he's consolidating, and eventually he becomes the biggest mine operator at Mine La Motte. But he sells out in, what's that say? 1766, he sells out to Jean Dacheroux, and to make that happen, a full inventory is made, which is great, and it splits he's selling both at Mine La Motte and he's selling stuff at La Saline, but very nicely for us, it's divided. And in this Mine La Motte sale, he's selling a half share in a house, again a maison, 6 slaves, 3 slave cabins, use the word cabane for the cabin, not maison, and interestingly, 4 lots due to him from other miners. So there's all kinds of interconnections here. He has apparently shares with other people who are working in the area. So it's not just simply one guy doing things, they're connected. In 1772, another rich source of material comes up with the spectacular bankruptcy and accusations of fraud of Pierre Gatto, which provide pages and pages and pages of wonderful information about mines. He has to, well, his widow, not his widow, his long-suffering wife, while he's fugitive, has to inventory some things, And one of them is a new house 24 and a half feet long by 17 feet wide. Well, that's pretty significant size for out in the middle of nowhere. That doesn't sound like a cabana to me, but what do I know? The Gatto Bear accounting also features this lovely document over here. The lead was removed from the mines originally by a horse, but later it's improved for wagons. And you get this magic word somewhere, charroy, which, to transport by cart. So this stuff is going by ox cart in sometime before this is written, 1770, to the river. And it also specifically mentions the Castor vein. I'm not good at that, so I'm going to go back here. Remoteness is a problem around this time, however. This is the time in 1774 when Chickasaw raiders kill 7 miners in the biggest massacre of miners during this colonial period at Mine La Motte. Joseph Vallée is one of them. Apparently they were caught in their sleep and slaughtered, but it really wasn't about them. Apparently some Kaskaskia Indians had killed some of these Chickasaw the day before, and the Chickasaw took out their revenge. Great story. It's all in these records. And Mine La Motte starts to tail off a little in this period. There's at least 4 or 5 years when it wasn't worked at all, but when it was worked, stuff was going to the river by cart. In order for that to happen, you can't use the Des Ursins route that we looked at before. You have to pull the lead road out of the valleys and put it on top of the ridges if you're going to have these wheeled carts make their way. And that is what happens. There will be many adjustments over the years as you're pulling out various sections. And it can be hard to try to place these where they go today. One of the neatest clues that we've had recently, and if this rings a bell for anybody, please let me know afterwards. There's this wonderful woman here named Ida Mary Schaff. And Ida Mary Schaff, in sometime before 1914, traveled the old lead road. Now, she's not talking about the Des Ursins route. She's talking about the ox cart or later improved route, partially on horseback. She says that she did the whole thing, 33 miles, except for 3 miles that she couldn't find. She finds a tree blazed with 3 notches, all kinds of cool stuff. She took more than a dozen photographs, glass slide, a glass plate negative, large format photographs, only 3 of which we've been able to find. So anybody can trace that up, great. But generally when you read, like the Southeast Missourian did a article that if you Google the route of the 3-notch road, that's what you're going to get. Or Millen James Kedrow, past Boy Scout, wrote an article about the 3-notch road. They're basically giving you Ida Schaff's research on the road. And instead of some lines, like we had with Des Ursins, we don't have distances and directions. Instead, we have points. And we can find these points by looking at the old surveys where, as Dr. Thompson had said, there will be a legend sometimes saying, this is the old road, this is the road to the old lead mine. And first we have to discount that it's not one of Dr. Thompson's roads, because there were at least two lead roads. And you can find them that way. You can also find references later in the territorial period where the county courts have been petitioned to improve a part of a road, and they'll say, well, gee, it's the lead road, or they're never calling it the 3-notch road, they're calling it the lead road or the road to Mine La Motte. And it makes the port would have been at La Saline, and then later at St. Mary's Landing, which would be then called Pratt's Landing, and then Rosier's Landing, down along the ridges to the mining area. There's a branch off here up to St. Genevieve. I suppose you could have gone along the river also, but it's highly unlikely that most of the lead ever went to St. Genevieve, because you're not going to pull a wagon loaded with 2,000 pounds of lead onto the Grand Champ to try to get it to the river. I mean, that's not a practical use. Certainly, some lead must have gone there, but it would have gone to the port at St. Mary or thereabouts. The next change that has something to do with our domain is actually not on the domain, it's just south of it, when in 1799, 13 New Bourbon families requested a concession for a village. Now, their petition claims that, these are from New Bourbon, so they're farming the Grand Champ. They're saying that the land is just no good and they can't possibly grow any crops, so they need to move to a new place, which is, of course, ridiculous, because that land is some of the richest farming land in the entire world. What they really want is to farm, but be a lot closer to those lead mines that they wish to work seasonally. And it's basically the group would be the Caillot de la Chance family, the de Geers that had married into them, Carpentier, a Verriat, and a Matisse make the request for a concession. Why are they doing it now? Why can't they just keep going up the road and stay the season? Probably it's because, 1799, probably it's because the Anglos are beginning to infiltrate in large numbers from across the river. And they're very worried that if they don't get to the mines now, they'll be cut off from them in the future by these aggressive Anglos. So in May of that same year, Trudeau grants them 6.9 square miles, and there's the concession. And I've turned it so that north is kind of north. This bit right here directly sits next to what would be called the domain. They built a compact French village along this stream, ran their long lots to farm here, and then the rest is the commons. And they had a 3-mile hike to get up to the mines. Strangely, so this is New Bourbon, so this is Pierre Charles Dehaut de la Sue de Louisiana, who is in charge. But strangely, his neighbor, Francois Valley, doesn't know what's going on, because in this letter in November of 1800, he writes to St. Louis to ask Charles Dehaut de la Sue, the son, who's in charge up in St. Louis, who are these 3 families who have packed up and moved to Mine La Motte from New Bourbon? Or is it that he knows, but he's worried that somebody's getting a little close to his turf? We don't know. We don't have a response. Eventually, the town of Fredericktown would entirely consume the village that they built, but until then, it was obviously intended to be a traditional French tripartite village. And this land swap document is an excellent case in point. It's a guy named Robert Crawford swapping his New Bourbon house with a guy named Toussaint. Interesting, we have a Crawford, we have an Anglo coming into this newly founded French village. It's already becoming Americanized, even a decade after it's been started. But here you see, you get he has a place in the village that would have been cut up into squares, 1 arpent wide and quartered, and you would have had your house with your palisade fence around it, the whole deal. You had a common field that was divided into the linear tear, and you would get one of those, and then you also got your right to use the commons, a traditional French tripartite village of the Illinois country. But then you read on and you see the thing that's being here in New Bourbon, it's a house, Maison de Poteau en Terre. Well, that's what we would expect. But look what's in Saint Michel. It's a Maison de Pièces sur Pièces. That's a horizontal log structure. And there are no known land documents from the village of Saint Michel for anything other than horizontal structures, except for one stone house much later. So it's kind of a mystery. Why did these French people who wanted to live like French people abandon French houses to build horizontal log houses? I don't know. If you know, tell me. So another key move in the development of St. Genevieve is there may not be a permanent village at St. Genevieve, but there sure is a permanent village right next door within walking distance. Next come Jean-Baptiste Saint-Jean-Beauvais, Jean-Baptiste Prat, Francois Vallée, and the second, and Jean-Baptiste Vallée, and I will in the future just call them the Magnets. These are, of course, the biggest names you can find, among the biggest names you can find in St. Genevieve. By 1800, they've consolidated their ownership of the domain. This is hard to follow in the documents because most of them, I guess, aren't there, but apparently they have done that and are alarmed also by this Anglo migration. So on the 15th of October, 1800, they request a concession from Delesseux in St. Louis so they can formalize this. Why didn't they do this early? Well, it probably took them a long time to buy out all of these independent operators so that they could request a concession, but they do request it. Delesseux says, oh yeah, that's a great idea. He endorses their petition, doesn't feel that he has the authority to give away 24,000 acres, so he sends it down to New Orleans. No one in the Illinois country knew that Spain had given away Louisiana to France. But by the time it's being processed in New Orleans, they do know, so that petition becomes a dead letter, and it is never perfected, I guess is the legal term. Spanish law, how are they doing this though? Because we saw the village of Saint Michel, and it's a traditional French grant like you would expect. It's on a river, and you're going to live along the river and run your long lots out. But this thing, this Main-la-Motte thing, this is way out in the middle of nowhere. Yes, it had been granted before as 2 league square. How did they envision that? The only way that Walter Schrader thinks they could have envisioned it, the Spaniards in charge now, was as a sitio, or what the French would have called a vacherie, that it was supposed to be a great cattle ranch, if you will, out in the middle of nowhere. So that's the conceit that they're doing it under, and this thing would have been a perfect square with its points at the cardinal directions. They run out of time, of course, with events. The Spanish can act, and then 30th of April, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty comes, and now all of a sudden they're Americans, and it's another new ball game. But luckily for them, perhaps, we have Article 3. This is the Senate copy, so it's in English. The inhabitants of the ceded territory shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and the religion which they profess. That's what they're going to hang their future on. So they have a survey made. The first survey of the domain ever is done in February 1806 by Nathaniel Cook. But and you've got to figure north is going this way, so you have to kind of mentally rotate it a little. But it's not a diamond. It's not a diamond because there were other claimants already. We have William Holmes up here, and we have a Beauvais down here. So Cook makes it work, and he makes it work by kind of squishing it sideways and adding on to both of the southern sides, and you get that peculiar double diamond that we saw on the topographic map. However, the Board of Land Commissioners, which had been created by Congress and was sitting in St. Louis, this is the page from Hunt's Minutes that someone had mentioned earlier. Well, there's a page from there. they rejected the claim in 1811. And you got to feel sorry for everybody involved in this, because the French largely did not have the right documentation, even beyond sophisticated people like the Magnates. You can imagine if they didn't have it, what chance did your smallholder have? Largely uneducated, just by paternalistic tradition, knowing that they were in their rights to hold land. It was very difficult. And the commissioners had the problem of being sent by Congress to do work without a lot of direction, but they understood Jefferson's vision. This all comes from the mind of Thomas Jefferson. We're going to take this new country and we're going to lay a perfect square grid across it. We will ignore everything. It will be a perfect square grid, and once that's done, we can give away, we can sell, we can retain, whatever, very simply and easily. But that doesn't fit the French mentalité. It doesn't work at all. You know, the French again, generally, except for the CTO, right, followed the topography and the rivers. Another obstacle. The Americans were looking to support the American yeoman farmer. This would be a rugged individual who, with his family, would live in the middle of a 640-acre perfectly square piece of land, not in a village. So they're unable to think beyond that also, and 640 acres is a lot smaller than 24,010. And they're only authorized to give out 640 as a maximum. Also, the Maine-La-Motte domain, while it's a cattle ranch, supposedly, it's mineral land, and everybody knows that. And the United States intends to keep the mineral lands and lease them to individuals. So it's a problem. There are also lots of disputes, again, because of the bad paperwork. So, confusing, eh? Here you can see that's the Golden Vein, that's the Castor Vein, the superseding land grants that Cook had to deal with, so he has to squash it in, and he does squash it in. Raynaud's original grant said that, hey, these mines are right in the middle of this square. Well, they can't be in the middle now, but at least they are there. Until well, we have to back up here a bit and just say that Pierre Verriat, who was a miner living at Maine-La-Motte in 1797, had acquired a 1/5 interest in the domain. Later, to pay off some debts, he relinquished that to the magnates, but this becomes a problem. Interesting guy, pretty well covered in Carl Eckberg's book. He freed a mulatto slave, more than Rode Christie, less than half his age, married her the next year. All of the magnates and the big wheels traveled from St. Genevieve to Verriat's house at Maine-La-Motte, which just may well have been in Saint Michel, since he was one of the founders of that, to attend the wedding, which was presided by Father Maxwell. So it was a total society affair, even though it was technically illegal. Well, Verriat dies, and I think Rode was pretty smart. She remarries a guy named Joseph Labbé. I don't know anything about Joseph Labbé. I would like to think that he's just a useful idiot for Rode to work her magic. I would really love to meet that lady, because she claims 745 acres, and I quote from the Land Commission, and I quote, on the waters of the River St. Francis in the vicinity of Maine-La-Motte by virtue of Pierre Verriat to see settlement right. Cook went out and surveyed the thing in 1806. By the way, he did that the week and a half before he had surveyed for the magnates, but it doesn't show up on the one for the magnates. I wonder why that was. Because his survey is this dotted line right here, and I'll be darned if the claim isn't right on top of the lead-bearing area, the single most important part of the domain. So the Land Commission which was headquartered in St. Louis, but they did visit other towns, including St. Genevieve, and they did have French speakers, but the magnates wouldn't have needed that. They were sophisticated. But the land commissioners must have accepted that it was truthful, and they, on the 12th of July in 1811, they certified the claim as legitimate, but they pared it down to the 640 acres. Yet another reason why the magnates are so circumspect about pushing the thing. How would you like to apply for 24,010 acres and get a receipt for 640? But anyway, they approve it, and there it is. The magnates cry foul, and here's a letter from, I think they made Pratt do it, laying out the whole thing. Hey, this is fraud. We had already bought the person out. It's mineral land, blah, 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 on and on and on. But it's too late. It's done. Because when letters patent are issued for a land concession, they are a statement by the sovereign vesting ownership in an individual and expunging, suppressing forever other claims, asserted or unasserted. That's the way they're supposed to work. And that's the way it worked in this case. It couldn't be settled until 1828 when Evariste Pratt just bought her out. But it will come up again. We get one more of these little weird things about the domain, where in 1810 a law was passed saying that the 16th section of every township is reserved for school lands. So they came a-coming saying, okay, we need that section, and there were lawsuits, and tenants on the domain were sued for destroying the government's wheat, which they hadn't planted, and cutting the government's trees, which they thought were their own. And finally, that gets settled again by purchase, but it goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1855, how long this thing drags out. The Supreme Court says, yes, that is the state's land, and they get bought out afterward. But every time something like this is happening, every time the land claim gets more complicated, every time a magnate dies or his heir dies, the domain ownership gets split up and split up and split up. But it doesn't get split by acres. It's a unified whole, and this is a very important part of why the domain persists. People get undivided fractional shares of the domain. And that's important when we compare it to what's going on to the north. Moses Austin is bringing capital and technology and a slave-worked lead plantation system to the old mines. He had relatively clear title, as long as he didn't have John Smith T's gun barrel at the back of his neck. But you could invest and know what you were investing in, and you did not have that at the domain. Louis Lynn, famous Louis Lynn, and Evariste Pratt would spend more than a decade reconsolidating ownership of the domain after it had split up after the passing of the magnates. And in 1837 and 1838, he went on a fundraising trip, a capital fundraising trip, first to Philadelphia and then to London. But he couldn't raise any money because he ran into the financial panic of 1837, and it was hard to show clear title. Well, finally, he thinks he gets it when the United States Congress had passed a law saying, okay, we give up. You guys, you magnates, some of whom are dead, own this land, except for any other causes. We're only giving up the United States' interest in the land. So he tries to go to London. He carries this document with him. He goes to London trying to sell it, but he doesn't have clear title. So nobody's going to invest in it. But he does continue some things that will be familiar to us. This is the earliest map we have of the interior of the domain. And you can see there's 9 furnaces in here, and here's the road to Pratt's Landing, and here's the road to St. Genevieve. And there's little holdings here and there. There's a village. He's offering a deal. You can come to the domain and sign on their books, because remember, they own the land, you don't own the land. land. You can sign on their books, and you will get a lot in the village. You will get an agricultural field outside the village, and you will get the right to dig lead at the diggings. Well, doesn't that sound a lot, doesn't that echo a French tripartite village type environment or a seigneurie of some kind? By 1838, they're still doing things the old way. They're still washing ore in the creeks, and they're still building these big log hearth furnaces, these large campfires to smelt the lead. And sometime in this period or a little after, the road starts to be called popularly the three-notch road. We don't know when. We don't know why this one was selected. There were three-notch roads all over the place because it was a way of marking the road while you're building it. You cut the three notches in the trees, and the men come after you and cut things, and then it's a way to keep the road marked afterward. But for some reason, the name three-notch road sticks to the lead road or the road to Mine La Motte that we've been talking about. We have a semi-seigneurial or French tripartite village system trying to mine lead down here in Mine La Motte, but meanwhile, up in the north, where land title is straight and capital is good, they're introducing in 1836 the first Scotch hearth furnace, a huge increase in technology, but they're not doing that at Mine La Motte. Dr. Lynn's death splits the domain up again in these undivided portions. Repeating the cycle. Lawsuits, divisions continue. Sometime around the Civil War, before and during the Civil War, the Fleming family comes in and they do the same thing. They acquire all of the ownership, and then a Fleming dies and it all splits up again, all making it impossible to really get investment going in the domain. And then in 1868, for us a big watershed happens. This unattractive document here, Francis Louis Valley, Frank, son of Charles Carpentier Valley, son of Francois Valley II, son of Francois Valley I, sold an undivided 6/7 of 1/6 of 39/40 of the Mine La Motte domain, and that removes the valley name from the domain for history after a 120-year run. Pause for weeping. What have I done here? Rowland Hazzard comes in after the Civil War, and things change and they stay the same. He buys a share in the domain, and he starts the final consolidation of the domain, which he achieves in a few years. He brings, technology's changing. The diamond drill, a very big deal, the diamond drill, because now you don't have to just worry about those surface deposits. You can go out with a diamond drill and you can drill boreholes all over the place. Look what's in there. You can decide where you're going to spend your money digging a shaft, and then where you're going to put those drifts and what angle you're going to put those drifts to get the lead ore. You don't have to do surface anymore. You can do shaft and drift. That goes, of course, St. Joe in the north, not to Mine La Motte, in 1869, but within a year, Rowland Hazzard has them at Mine La Motte. Rowland Hazzard is this filthy rich Rhode Island industrialist. Woolen mills were his big deal. And he was also a philosopher, a moral philosopher, apparently a really, really great guy. Somehow he decided he wanted to get into mining, and he bought an empire out here. The next year, we get the Belmont branch of the St. Louis Iron Mountain Railroad. Well, that's huge, not only because it provides good transportation for your lead. The most important part is you can get coal from southern Illinois to Mine La Motte very cheaply. You don't have to cut wood. By 1871, the entire Mine La Motte domain was denuded of timber, plus the 14,000 extra timber acres that Hazzard had bought. But now you can bring in coal. Hazzard took over sole control of the domain, and in 1876 he built that lovely building, which was a fully modern mill. That thing could produce 100 tons of ore daily. So he could produce in 2 days what Reynaud took a year to produce. Now he never did that, but he could. It required the labor of 22 men, 1 boy, and 4 mules to do that. Let's look at that lead production. During the entire colonial period, 81 years, 1723 to 1803, it's estimated that 8,000 tons of pig lead came out of Mine La Motte, and it was the dominant mine in the area. If you average the Hazzard years, it would have taken him 3.5 years to produce 8,000 tons of pig lead. You know, the technological stuff is overcoming the remoteness and the need for lots of free compulsory labor. But some of the old things continue. This is a part of a page from the Miners Register. You could still, even in the Hazzard industrial years, you could go there and sign up to get a little plot that you didn't own but that you had rights on, and you could dig your hole in the ground and pull up your ore as long as you sold it to Rowland Hazzard. And here we see Adam Hertzinger signed up, but not only did he do that, the rules allowed him to put this ad in the newspaper to sell a share of the share that he was working that he didn't own. So this old system continues on. Perhaps if Hazzard had been a man of years earlier, he would have tried to set up a lead plantation or a seigneurial system. Are you giving me some kind of a signal?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Okay. I want to read what the St. Louis mine inspector had to say about this. It lets you know the type of organization Hazzard was running, both the good and the bad.
What does it date?
This is 1902. The Mine La Motte has been owned for years past, first by Mr. Rowland Hazzard and since then by Mr. S.H. Lethe, both being old men. The large body of land with its diversified interests of a mining and smelting plant, with a supply store doing a good business, drugstore, post office, churches, schoolhouses, many buildings furnishing homes for the miners, over 100 farms to visit and collect rents from, a ranch containing 2,500 acres, all fenced, the specialty being made of raising fine cattle, mules, and hogs, together with a fine residence for the owner and also one for the superintendent, proved too tempting a bait to the pride, and in its last analysis to be more of a hobby with these old gentlemen of ample means than a business proposition, with the result that no effort was made to increase the output of the mines, which would have been done easily many-fold. So, you know, he was a country squire running a quasi-seigneurial system, but to reasonably good effect. Again, that map in the background, that's his own plat. He had his own land office, because again, you didn't own the land, he owned the land, but it was registered in his office. We're getting really close to the end now because the corporate management comes in, which I'm really not all that interested in, but we have to wind it up. Still though, under corporate management, the St. Joe Lead Company and others, you still have this farm lease stuff going on. And that persists up until the end of the Great War. But other things end, and the mine company destroys the village. They get out of owning a village. And then with this, when the end comes for the unity of the domain, of course it comes typed. And it comes in that sale, which on March 15th, 1929, finally, after 206 years, actual acres of the domain are split off and sold to another individual, bringing the unity of the domain to an end. Then at 7 o'clock in the morning, on 12th of July, 1958, mining stops. September of 1961, the pumps are shut off, flooding the mines, presumably forever. So now the mining area is commemorated by this plaque here, erected in 1933 by the Daughters of the American Colonists on another one of those early land sales of St. Joe Lead, splitting up the domain. And there, it's on that boulder, and so you can see how the Historic Madison County Society has been working to redevelop this once abandoned roadside park into a trailhead, if you will, for an auto route or bike route to the old, to reconnect the old Mine La Motte and the village of Saint Michel to the French Creole corridor from which it's been severed for far too long. And if you were to drive the wagon route today, that's where it would be. I thank you for your kind attention.